I took off the heavy diamond bracelet, pulled the family signet ring from my finger, and slammed them right onto the white tablecloth in front of my stepmother. The entire luxury restaurant went dead silent. Dozens of wealthy strangers stopped eating, their eyes darting between my trembling hands and the security guards moving toward me. "You leave this table, and you leave with absolutely nothing," my stepfather whispered, his face twisted in cold fury. I didn't beg, I didn't cry. Instead, I turned my back on their millions and walked straight toward a tearful, poorly dressed woman at table, for who was holding out her arms to me. What happened next changed my life forever. To find out how a devastating public rejection led me to my real family, hit that subscribe button right now, and don't miss the rest of this unforgettable story. My name is Queen Lin, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been framed by perfection. I am 22 years old, an age where most young adults are frantically trying to piece together their futures. For me, however, my future had always seemed predetermined, sketched out in fine lines of luxury, high society, and impeccable reputation. By profession, or rather by passion, I work as a junior social worker at a local rehabilitation center for underprivileged children. It is a quiet, demanding job that pays very little but rewards the soul immensely. I am, by nature, a person driven by empathy. I have always believed that the true measure of a person is found in how they treat those who can do nothing for them. I value hard work, I value kindness, and above all, I value the family that took me in when I had no one else. You see? I was adopted. Grace and Richard Lin, two of the most prominent figures in the city's upper crest, brought me into their home when I was just a little girl. From that day forward, my world became a blur of sprawling estates, manicured lawns, and silent corridors. Our family home is a magnificent neoclassical mansion situated in the most exclusive gated community in the city. It is a structure made of white marble and towering glass windows that look out over a perfectly landscaped garden. From the outside, it is the absolute definition of the American dream, an oasis of economic stability and generational wealth. Growing up, my daily routine was structured around maintaining this grand image. My mornings began with breakfast in a dining room large enough to host a gala, followed by private tutoring, and later, prestigious schools. Richard, my stepfather, is a man of immense power, a corporate titan whose presence commands immediate silence in any room he enters. Grace, my stepmother, is the epitome of eleganza woman who moves through life with an icy poise, ensuring that every charity gala, every social gathering, and every family portrait is absolutely flawless. For a very long time, I genuinely believed our household was a sanctuary of harmony. I remember winters spent sitting by the grand fireplace, listening to Richard talk about his business triumphs, while Grace gently adjusted the collar of my designer dress. They provided me with everything a child could ever ask for: the finest education, travels across the globe, and a last name that opened every closed door. I grew up feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude toward them. They were my rescuers, the benevolent guardians who saved me from an uncertain fate in the foster care system. Because of this, I made it my life's mission to be the perfect daughter. I kept my grades at the top of my class, I never spoke out of turn, and I constantly sought their approval in everything I did. Our home ran like a beautifully synchronized clock. The domestic staff moved like ghosts. The meals were always good, and the conversations around the dinner table were always pleasant, focusing on high art, philanthropy, and corporate growth. I found comfort in this predictability. I mistook their strict rules for protective love, and I mistook their obsession with my public behavior as genuine care for my well-being. I walked through those marble hallways with a light heart, convinced that I was a cherished piece of their magnificent world, completely unaware that even the most beautiful cages are still built with bars. For 22 years, I navigated that golden cage with a sense of comfort. Life moved forward in a comfortable, predictable rhythm. And as the autumn breeze began to cool the city streets, my focus turned entirely toward my upcoming 22nd birthday. It was a milestone that felt significant, a threshold into true adulthood. In our household, birthdays were not just personal celebrations. They were grand, carefully orchestrated social events. Grace had already spent weeks coordinating with the city's most exclusive French restaurant, selecting a menu, and curating a guest list comprised of influential board members, local politicians, and corporate allies. In the weeks leading up to the dinner, my days were filled with a quiet contentment. At the rehabilitation center, I was helping a young boy named Leo learn to read, a slow but deeply rewarding process. Every afternoon, I would return home to the mansion, my heart full from the small victories of my job, ready to share my day during dinner. I remember one specific evening, sitting beneath the glittering crystal chandelier in the dining room. I was enthusiastically describing how Leo had finally mastered a full sentence on his own. Richard smiled warmly, nodding his approval as he sipped his vintage wine, while Grace reached across the table to gently pat my hand, telling me how wonderful it was that I possessed such a caring spirit. In those moments, the warmth felt entirely real. I felt surrounded by a protective blanket of familial love, secure in the belief that my parents, despite their high society stature, truly valued the empathy they had raised me to cultivate. My hopes for the future were simple yet profound. I wanted to eventually manage the Foundation's outreach programs, utilizing the Lin family resources to expand our shelter, while continuing to be a daughter who brought honor to their name. Yet, beneath the polished surface of our perfect life, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift began to occur. It started with minor details that I initially brushed aside as mere stress from Richard's ongoing corporate mergers. One evening, as I walked past Richard's private study to head up to my bedroom, the heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I caught the tail end of a conversation between Grace's voice, usually a smooth, melodic hum, carried a sharp, calculated edge. She was discussing the guest list for my birthday dinner, mentioning a prominent real estate mogul and his son. When Richard questioned whether the event should focus more on my personal milestone rather than business networking, Grace replied with a cold, matter-of-fact tone that sent a sudden chill down my spine. She said that every public gathering was an investment, and that at 22, it was time for me to start paying dividends to the family name. The word dividends echoed uncomfortably in my mind. The next morning at breakfast, when I casually mentioned that I wanted to invite a few of my colleagues from the rehabilitation center to the dinner, the atmosphere instantly froze. Grace froze with her teacup halfway to her lips, her eyes narrowing into two icy points. Richard suddenly became intensely interested in his financial newspaper, completely ignoring my request. Grace slowly lowered her cup, her face instantly melting back into her trademark flawless smile, and smoothly changed the subject to the designer dress she had imported for me. It was a fleeting moment, a tiny fracture in the porcelain facade of our home, but for the very first time in my life, a faint, unsettling shadow of doubt cast itself over my heart. That shadow deepened into a chilling reality just 3 days before my 22nd birthday. I arrived at the rehabilitation center in the morning, holding a box of fresh books I had purchased for Leo and the other children. But the moment I stepped through the front doors, the usual cheerful chatter of the reception area was missing. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence hung in the air. My supervisor, a kind woman who had dedicated 30 years of her life to social work, sat at her desk with her head in her hands. When she looked up and saw me, her eyes were filled with a mixture of sorrow and profound confusion. She slowly handed me an official letter that had arrived via courier just an hour earlier. I looked down at the crisp, cream-colored stationery, and my breath caught in my throat. At the top of the page was the embossed gold logo of the Lin Family Philanthropic Foundation. It was a formal notice, signed directly by Grace, stating that the foundation was immediately terminating its annual financial subsidy to the center. This grant covered over half of our operational costs, paying for the children's therapy, hot meals, and educational supplies. The letter cited a vague restructuring of corporate philanthropic priorities, offering no further explanation. My hands began to tremble, but I did not cry out, nor did I voice the sudden panic rising in my chest. Instead, I quietly set my keys on the desk, folded the letter precisely, and walked straight out to my car. My mind raced during the entire drive back to the mansion. I refused to let anger dictate my movements. Instead, I focused on logic, convincing myself that this must be a terrible administrative mistake, a clerical error that Grace would laugh about once it was brought to her attention. When I entered the grand foyer of our home, the house was intensely quiet. I found Grace in the sunroom, elegantly sipping her afternoon espresso while reviewing seating arrangements for my birthday gala. I approached her quietly, holding the folded letter in my hand. I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed the document softly on the glass table next to her saucer and sat in the armchair opposite her, keeping my posture straight and my hands folded neatly in my lap. I looked her directly in the eyes, waiting for her reaction. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't even look down at the paper. She merely set her espresso cup down with a soft click and met my gaze with an expression of profound, unbothered indifference. For a long-running minute, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt heavier than concrete. She looked at me not as a mother looks at a daughter she loves, but as a seasoned chess player looks at a pawn that has suddenly moved out of its designated square. There was an icy finality in her posture that made my chest tighten. I felt a cold knot of worry tighten in my stomach, a realization that the warmth I had trusted for over 2 decades was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a stark, calculating environment I barely recognized. I remained completely still, my heart hammering against my ribs, realizing that a silent war had just been declared, and I was entirely unprepared for what was coming next. Grace finally broke the agonizing silence, her voice smooth like velvet but sharp like glass. She told me, without a hint of remorse, that the foundation's funds belonged to those who cooperated with the family's vision. She casually remarked that if I chose to waste my time on lost causes, I could not expect the Lin family to finance my sentimental hobbies. She then stood up, smoothed her designer skirt, and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the weight of her cold words. The emotional pain of her betrayal was a sharp ache in my chest, but it was followed by a deeper burning need to understand how the people who raised me could be so transactional. The following evening, the mansion felt entirely different, no longer a sanctuary, but a grand fortress of secrets. Richard and Grace had left early to attend a pre-birthday charity auction across town, leaving the house empty. Driven by an unsettling intuition, I found myself standing before the heavy oak doors of Richard's private study. My hands shook as I turned the brass handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it clicked open. The room smelled of old leather and expensive cigars. I stepped inside, my heart racing, and approached his massive mahogany desk. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for, but my eyes were drawn to a small, silver key sitting inside a crystal tray. My instincts took over. I used the key to open the bottom desk drawer, revealing a thick, unmarked leather binder. I began flipping through the pages, through corporate tax exemptions and trust fund allocations, until my eyes locked onto my own legal name, Queen Lin. As I read the documents, the room seemed to spin. There were legal transcripts and financial records from 20 years ago, dating back to the exact time I was adopted. My breath caught in my throat as the truth unraveled on the crisp pages before me. I was not a charity case saved from the foster system out of pure benevolence. My biological parents had not abandoned me. They had been forced to give me up after a tragic financial collapse, heavily manipulated by Richard's own firm to acquire my late grandfather's aita land estate. Worse still, the documents revealed that a massive, restricted trust fund had been established in my name by my grandfather, a fund that could only be managed by my legal guardians until my 22nd birthday. Grace and Richard had been receiving millions in state subsidies and management fees over the last 2 decades just for keeping me under their roof. The luxury I grew up in, the elite schools, the designer closet hadn't been funded by their generosity. It had been funded by my own stolen heritage. A profound suffocating sorrow washed over me, instantly followed by a wave of clarity. The warmth, the smiles, the family dinners, it was all a beautifully constructed business strategy. I closed the binder, locked the drawer, and placed the key back in the tray with trembling fingers. As I walked out of the study and looked at the grand, empty hallway, the life I knew was officially gone. The illusion of my loving family had completely shattered, and I knew that tomorrow night, at my 22nd birthday dinner, everything would change forever. I slept very little that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the cold financial figures from Richard's secret binder flashed behind my eyelids. I spent the next morning preparing myself, not with tears, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve. I decided that I would not flee in secret. I would attend the birthday gala, look my stepparents in the eyes, and quietly demand the restoration of the funding for the rehabilitation center, using the knowledge of my grandfather's trust fund as my leverage. It was a concrete, dignified step to reclaim my autonomy and protect the children who depended on me. When evening arrived, The French restaurant, L'Avenir, was the epitome of high society The entire main dining room had been reserved for the Lin family. Glittering crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, casting a warm glow over round tables draped in pristine white linen. As I walked into the room wearing the elegant, imported emerald dress Grace had chosen for me, heads turned and polite applause rippled through the crowd. Richard stood near the center bar, laughing with a group of city council members, while Grace moved gracefully between tables, her smile radiant and utterly flawless. I took my seat at the main family table, my heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I waited for the right moment, a quiet gap between the main course and the speeches, to ask Richard and Grace for a private word in the lobby. But before I could even catch Richard's eye, Grace stood up, tapping her crystal glass with a silver spoon. The room fell perfectly silent. Grace smiled warmly at the crowd, her eyes sweeping across the room before resting on me with a terrifyingly blank expression. She began her speech by thanking everyone for celebrating my 22nd birthday, praising the family's dedication to excellence. Then, her tone shifted, becoming noticeably cooler, though her public smile never faded. She announced to the entire room that, as of tonight, I had decided to pursue a path that no longer aligned with the values, expectations, or the future of the Lin corporate legacy. With an incredibly calm, calculated voice, Grace stated that the family respected my choice to distance myself from them, and therefore, they were officially announcing my departure from the family estate and the corporate lineage, effective immediately. A collective gasp echoed through the elegant dining room. The room seemed to lose all its warmth. My heart stopped. I looked at Richard, expecting a sliver of fatherly hesitation, but he merely nodded in agreement, looking at me as if I were a breached contract. Grace had completely blindsided me, using my milestone birthday to publicly disown me before I could even utter a single word about the documents I had found. The pressure in the room became suffocating, as dozens of wealthy strangers stared at me with pity and judgment. I was trapped in the spotlight of their rejection, realization washing over me that they would rather destroy my social standing publicly than risk me questioning their financial empire. The emotional weight of 22 years of a lie pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, yet I refused to let them see me break. I gathered every ounce of my dignity, keeping my chin high as I slowly stood up from the plush velvet chair. The whispers around the room grew louder, a low buzz of judgment that made my ears ring. I looked directly at Richard, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions tearing through my soul, and quietly asked him if this was truly how they intended to honor my grandfather's legacy and the trust he had left behind. For a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine panic crossed Richard's face, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, condescending sneer. He leaned forward, whispering so only those at our immediate table could hear, telling me that I was being incredibly ungrateful. He muttered that I had nothing, owned nothing, and that without their name, I was absolutely nobody in this city. Grace didn't even look at me. She simply waved her hand toward the restaurant manager, softly requesting that my belongings be removed from the estate by morning. The humiliation was absolute. I was being discarded in front of the entire high society like a piece of faulty machinery that was no longer useful to their corporate machinery. I turned away from the head table, my hands trembling so intensely that I had to clench my fists to hide it. I began walking down the long aisle toward the exit, feeling completely hollow, utterly defeated, and more alone than I had ever been in my entire life. Every door to the world I knew had just slammed shut in my face, and I had nowhere to go, no savings of my own, and no family left to turn to. But as I neared the middle of the restaurant, trying to keep my eyes focused on the exit doors, I felt a strange, magnetic pull toward table 4. Unlike the other tables filled with wealthy executives in tailored tuxedos, this table was occupied by people who stood out completely. There was an older woman wearing a simple, worn cardigan, and a young man in a neat but inexpensive suit. As I passed them, I realized they weren't whispering or judging me. Instead, the woman was leaning forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. Tears were streaming openly down her lined face, and her eyes were locked onto mine with a look of profound, agonizing recognition. The young man next to her had his arm around her shoulders, his gaze fixed on me with a mixture of protective anger and deep, sorrowful warmth. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat as a strange, unexplainable wave of familiarity washed over me. In that moment of absolute darkness, where the people who raised me had completely cast me aside, the intense, loving gaze from the strangers at table 4 felt like a warm light piercing through a thick fog. I didn't know who they were, but the sheer emotion radiating from their table made the rest of the crowded restaurant completely fade into the background, opening a tiny, unexpected door of hope in my shattered heart. But the fragile peace of that moment was abruptly shattered by Grace's icy voice cutting through the air from the head table. She called out to the restaurant manager, her tone dripping with artificial polite concern, stating that a distressed guest was disrupting the evening and needed to be escorted out by security immediately. 2 burly security guards in dark suits immediately began moving toward me from the foyer. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold wave of panic washed over me. I was about to be publicly thrown out of my own birthday celebration like a common criminal. The humiliation felt heavy enough to crush me completely. But before the guards could reach my side, the older woman at table 4 stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the polished marble floor, drawing the attention of the entire room. She didn't shout, but her voice carried a fierce, trembling power that instantly halted the security guards in their tracks. She told the guards to stop right where they were, declaring that nobody was touching her daughter. A suffocating silence descended upon the restaurant. Grace froze, her wineglass hovering inches from her lips, while Richard's face turned an ashen shade of gray. The woman stepped away from her table and walked toward me, her eyes never leaving my face. Tears were still pouring down her cheeks, but her posture was filled with an undeniable, quiet dignity. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers gently brushing against my shoulder. She looked past me, straight at the head table where my stepparents sat. With absolute clarity and courage, she addresses the entire room, stating that 20 years ago, her family was torn apart by corporate greed and legal deception. She revealed that she was Sarah, and the young man beside her was David, my biological brother. She exposed the truth to the elite crowd, explaining Richard's firm had manipulated their family's financial crisis to seize their land estate and take her little girl away under the guise of illegal adoption. She told the crowd that they had spent 2 decades searching for me, fighting through sealed records and corporate walls, only to find me tonight, on my 22nd birthday, being discarded by the very people who had stolen my heritage. The restaurant erupted into a sea of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. The glitz and glamour of the Lin family empire seemed to melt away under the burning light of the truth. Grace desperately tried to regain control, loudly dismissing Sarah's words as a ridiculous fabrication, while Richard frantically gestured for the security guards to clear the room. I stood in the absolute center of the chaos, my mind spinning as the pieces of my fractured life suddenly locked into place. I was caught between the cold, wealthy dynasty that had just cast me out, and the tearful, open arms of the biological family I had thought were gone forever. It was the highest point of tension I had ever faced, and the next choice would define the rest of my life. Richard stepped forward from the head table, his voice losing its usual calculated calm, desperately trying to reassert his authority. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of anger and hidden fear, and told me that if I walked out that door with those strangers, I would leave with absolutely nothing. He warned me that my life, my future, and my standing in this society would be completely erased, and that I would never be allowed to step foot in his home again. Grace sat perfectly still, her face a rigid mask of aristocratic disdain, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to realize the financial cost of walking away. The entire restaurant held its breath, dozens of pairs of eyes darting between the wealthy corporate titans and the humble family at table 4. I took a deep, steadying breath. In that moment, the fear that had gripped my heart for the past few days completely vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of clarity and unshakable pride. I looked at Richard, Tenet, Grace, and realized that the wealth they were threatening to withhold was never theirs to give. It was a currency built on deception and the emotional manipulation of my life. I smiled softly, a genuine liberated smile that they had never seen on my face before. With slow, deliberate movements, I reached up to my right hand. I unclasped the heavy diamond bracelet Grace had forced me to wear, and slowly pulled the family heirloom signet ring from my finger, the symbols of the Lin family legacy that I had once carried with such unearned gratitude. I stepped toward the head table and placed the glittering jewelry quietly on the white tablecloth right in front of Richard. I told him, my voice echoing clearly through the silent room, that he could keep his money, his house, and his name, because they were empty things that could never buy a real family. I looked him dead in the eyes and said that I was finally leaving his cage, not as a victim, but as a person who finally knew her own worth. Turning my back on the head table for the very last time, I walked toward Sarah and David. The collective gasp of the crowd faded into white noise. As I reached them, David stepped forward, his eyes filled with a fierce, protective pride, and gently wrapped his jacket around my shivering shoulders. Sarah reached out, her hands warm and trembling, and pulled me into a tight, fierce embrace that smelled faintly of lavender and home warmth that was completely real, entirely unconditional, and completely free of strings. The shock on the faces of the high society guests was absolute. They had expected me to beg for forgiveness, to kneel before the Lin family fortune. Instead, they watched a young woman walk away from millions with her head held high, choosing love over a gilded lie. As the three of us walked out of the grand doors of the restaurant together, leaving the shouting and the flashing lights behind, I knew there was no turning back, and for the first time in 22 years, I felt completely free. The crisp night air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin, washing away the suffocating atmosphere of the restaurant. We didn't climb into a chauffeured limousine. Instead, we walked together toward David's modest sedan. The ride to their home was filled with a gentle, quiet conversation, as if we were all carefully handling a beautiful, fragile miracle. They took me to a small, cozy apartment on the eastern side of the city. The rooms were filled with mismatched furniture, worn books, and the rich scent of homemade cinnamon tea. It was a stark contrast to the cold, marble halls of the Lin mansion, yet every corner of this small space radiated an undeniable, comforting warmth. In the weeks that followed, my life began to transform in ways I had never thought possible. I officially dropped the name Lin, reclaiming my original birth name, Queen Vance. Living with Sarah and David felt like learning to breathe properly for the very first time. There were no rigid rules, no expectations to maintain a flawless public image, and no underlying corporate motives. We spent our evenings sitting around a small wooden kitchen table, looking through old photograph albums that Sarah had safely kept hidden for over 2 decades. She showed me pictures of my father, a hardworking man who had passed away years ago, always holding on to the hope that we would find each other again. David shared stories of his struggles and victories, and for the first time, I felt the profound strength of real brotherly protection. Meanwhile, justice began to unfold in its own quiet, natural way. The truth that had exploded at the restaurant that night could not be contained. The high society guests who witnessed the confrontation began to quietly distance themselves from Grace and Richard. In their exclusive social circles, reputation was everything, and the revelation of their past legal deceptions and the public mistreatment of their adopted daughter ruined their polished image. Major corporate investors, anxious to protect their own public standing, slowly began to withdraw from Richard's firm. No legal battles or public shouting matches were necessary. The natural consequences of their own cold actions caused their business empire to steadily decline. More importantly, a wonderful new opportunity opened up for the children at the rehabilitation center. A prominent local philanthropist, who had been present at the restaurant and deeply moved by my quiet dignity, stepped forward to support our cause. He reached out to me directly, offering a massive, long-term independent grant that completely covered all our operational costs, ensuring that Leo and the other children would continue to receive their therapy and education. I was promoted to a full-time program coordinator, allowed to manage the foundation with absolute creative freedom. As I stood in the freshly painted library of the center, watching Leo proudly read a whole book by himself, I realized that my decision to walk away from the Lin fortune had not cost me my future. Instead, it had given me a real, purposeful life, built on truth, love, and a genuine family that would never let me go. A full year had passed since that fateful evening at the restaurant, and today, I was celebrating my 23rd birthday. But this year the atmosphere could not have been more different. There were no grand crystal chandeliers, no cameras, no corporate executives using my milestone for public relations, and no designer dresses meant to hide the real me. Instead, our small living room was decorated with simple, colorful paper banners that David had hung up himself. The aroma of a home-cooked dinner filled every corner of the apartment, and the sounds of genuine laughter bounced off the walls. Sitting around our small wooden table were Sarah, David, and a few close, sincere friends from the rehabilitation center. As Sarah walked out of the kitchen holding a modest, homemade strawberry cake with a single, brightly burning candle, tears of absolute happiness welled up in my eyes. I looked around the room at the smiling faces of the people who loved me unconditionally. Just for who I was, not for what I was worth on a corporate balance sheet. This journey taught me an invaluable lesson about the true meaning of family. For 22 years, I lived in a magnificent, golden cage, believing that love was something that had to be earned through absolute obedience and flawless perfection. I used to think that a family was defined by a shared wealthy name, elite status, and financial security. But now, I know the beautiful truth. True family is not built on legal documents, corporate investments, or the heavy walls of a marble mansion. True family is found in the hearts of those who stand by you when you have nothing left to offer. It is found in the hands that lift you up when you are at your lowest point, and the voices that speak the truth, even when the entire world is whispering against you. Walking away from the Lynn fortune was terrifying, but standing up for my own dignity allowed me to reclaim my true heritage, legacy of love, resilience, and authentic connection. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and blew out the candle, knowing that every single one of my wishes had already come true. Thank you so much for following Queen's emotional and inspiring journey from the cold marble halls to the true warmth of a real family. Her courage reminds us all that our worth is never defined by how others treat us, but by the dignity we choose to keep. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Queen's shoes at that restaurant? Would you have had the courage to leave the ring on the table and walk away from millions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart and inspired you, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Give this video a thumbs up and share it with your loved ones. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming emotional family dramas. Thank you for watching, and stay strong, stay true.